Welcome back, everyone. We are still feeling the energy here from the Equator Prize Award ceremony. For this next session, we dive deeper into the critical conversation happening at the nexus of human rights and the environment. I am honored to present our next session, Reimagining Conservation, aligning nature conservation and human rights. Please enjoy. Former United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon continues to be one of the world's strongest champions and leading voices for sustainable development and our call for action to address the dual nature climate crisis. We are very pleased to be able to present to you his message on what can we do or what can be done to take greater actions and promote a green recovery for people, for planet, and for prosperity. Let's take a look.
Honorable Secretary General of the OECD, Angel Gurria, Co-President of the Club of Rome, Sandrine Dixon Dicklev, Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and all guests joining us online. At the outset, I'd like to extend my heartfelt congratulations on the Nature for Life Hub in line with the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. For the past 7 decades, the UN has never stopped striving to achieve co-prosperity of the international community. However, the United States' withdrawal from the Paris Climate Change Agreement and the WHO have demonstrated our collective vulnerability. In the last few years, we have witnessed the emergence of unilateralism, nationalism, and provincialism around the world. It is undeniable that we have regrettably neglected our planet and the nature. In fact, multiple research indicates infectious diseases, including the COVID-19, is related to climate change, callous disregard for biodiversity, and the over-exploitation of the environment. We are now faced with continuous loss of biodiversity and the planet crisis. Pope Francis has said the coronavirus pandemic is one of the nature's responses to humans ignoring the current ecological crisis. COVID-19 could very well be the last warning from the nature. To address such a crisis, some countries are striving to turn the crisis caused by COVID-19 into an opportunity for green recovery. As exemplary cases of green recovery, European Union's Green Deal and the Green New Deal explored in the United States and Korea will undoubtedly lead to transformation of socio-economic paradigm, creating an entirely different business environment. Therefore, it is essential for companies and industries to embrace the crisis and turn it into an opportunity. Here is something to be considered. The ongoing Green New Deal, in a way, appeared to be developed countries' excuse to find its own way out of the crisis. I believe this policy's true value will only be unleashed when it is developed and upgraded into a global Green New Deal under the framework of multilateralism. In other words, I'm sincerely urging a paradigm shift to green business that will enable us to utilize international resources for rebuilding. At the same time, enabling developing countries with a higher environmental risk to be able to go through the recovery process while preserving the biodiversity. The Green New Deal, which includes the green transition of industries and buildings and the transition to renewable energy, will then be able to contribute to the preservation of biodiversity and sustainable development. Furthermore, empower developing countries to reap greater profit and achieve growth through the Green New Deal. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time for bold, decisive action. We must bend the curve of climate change and biodiversity loss. In this decade, the decade of action, we must commit to protecting and restoring our ecosystems and creating a planetary safety net for the coming century through green recovery. Let us make today the turning point for this change. Let us make the 75th anniversary the stepping stone to accelerate the green transition. Thank you.
My name is Teddy Bagilat Jr. I'm an Indigenous person and human rights advocate and parliamentarian from the Philippines. Take a moment to breathe and maybe even close your eyes. What do you picture when you imagine nature? Is it a vast landscape or seascape teeming with wildlife? Or maybe a small urban garden? Is it territories and areas shaped and nurtured by communities over generations? Or concerns about insects or predators that threaten your livelihoods? Or perhaps you don't think of nature per se, but rather of Mother Earth and all beings interconnected. Whatever you imagine indicates how you might approach debates about nature conservation, what is and should be, how and by whom it should be undertaken, and towards what aims. These debates are increasingly polarized as consumer demand increases, industrial exploitation of nature, and the people who depend most closely on forests, rivers, grasslands, and reefs are squeezed into smaller and smaller areas. The effects of climate and ecological breakdown force people both into and away from conflict, and this further exacerbates inequalities and pressures on nature. Since the dawn of humankind, diverse worldviews and relationships with our surroundings have been the basis for diversity of life on Earth. Indigenous peoples and local communities have cared for most of our planet and life within it for millennia and are increasingly recognized as such. However, within just the past 150 years, what is known as the Yellowstone model of protected areas became the touchstone of mainstream nature conservation. This has often led to the dispossession of communities from the very lands and territories they helped create and sustain. The worldview and power imbalances underpinning this approach to nature conservation have been increasingly held up to scrutiny in recent years for human rights violations in the name of conservation. Indigenous peoples and communities have mobilized around the world to defend their territories and to advocate for recognition of their deep relationships with Mother Earth. But as conservation-related conflicts continue and scientific warnings about the state of the planet grow ever more dire, it has never been more important to reimagine conservation and find common ground between divergent worldviews.
My name is Holly Jonas, and I'm the Global Coordinator of the ICCA Consortium, the Global Association for Territories of Life. I'm co-moderating this session today with Teddy. To pick up on his points, multiple scientific reports have concluded that we have very few years left to change the course of humanity, or really risk going past the planetary point of no return. A raft of multilateral environmental instruments has made important gains, but is clearly not enough to stem the tide of loss. At the same time, the UN human rights system has advanced our understanding of the interconnections between human rights and a safe, healthy, and sustainable environment, as well as the impacts of conservation measures, particularly on the rights of Indigenous peoples and communities. But is something else missing? Originally deemed the super year for nature, 2020 was quickly subsumed by the COVID-19 pandemic. As we struggle to flatten the global curve, we are also witnessing a surge of movements for social and racial justice rising up along the fault lines of inequality. Economic recovery plans provide an opportunity to fast-track systemic reforms to tackle the drivers of extreme poverty, biodiversity loss, and climate breakdown. Discussions of structural racism and discrimination are finding purchase, including in the environmental movement. In these times of uncertainty, fear, and division, we really need common threads to unite us in the pursuit of a healthy and equitable planet for everyone, both in current and future generations. What can we learn, particularly from Indigenous peoples and communities, and what is the role of human rights within that? These are just some of the key issues we will explore in this session today. It is the first in a series of dialogues on conservation and human rights that we are organizing with UNDP, and we're thrilled to have an exciting group of speakers and panelists with us today. So in order to center us in shared values and hear from just a few of the amazing Indigenous and grassroots leaders around the world, we are pleased to share a clip from a short film on Territories of Life that's produced with Life Mosaic.
La tierra, la selva es vivo. El río, las lagunas, las montañas, los pantanales, los árboles, todo es un ser vivo, es viviente.
En este territorio hemos nacido, en este territorio hemos aprendido, en este territorio también hemos crecido. Sabemos lo que es conservar un territorio. ¿Quién más experto en proteger o en conservación que nosotros, los pueblos indígenas?
These are the areas that sustain life. These are the areas that host a whole diverse range of flora and fauna. These are the areas that provide livelihood to people. ICCAs exist because of local communities and Indigenous peoples.
When there is a strong bond between a community and a territory, the territory provides more than sustenance. It gives life to culture, to diversity, identity. It provides security to people. It is a territory of life.
TICA, por su sigla, se refiere a territorios indígenas de conservación y áreas conservadas por comunidades locales. Es más bien una sigla que utilizamos para ponernos de acuerdo y hablar un lenguaje común entre muchos idiomas y muchas culturas diferentes.
Yo creo que todos los pueblos originarios hemos sido TICA. Entonces los TICA somos aquellas comunidades que protegemos el territorio y la biodiversidad para tener un uso sustentable en el tiempo, así como lo hicieron los pueblos originarios de tiempos inmemoriales, ¿no?
ICCAs are everywhere in the world. You can find them in each country, with each climate, with each culture, and with each type of governance system. We are indigenous nomadic peoples. And for thousands of years, we are living in our biodiverse area with conserving all the aspects of our territories and all the assets that we have in our territories. Rivers, mountains, lakes, grazing areas, rangelands, forests, springs, and sacred sites, and livestock, and different breeds of camels, sheep, goats, birds, and wildlife, and all of them are part of our heart and our soul. ICCA for me as an indigenous person is territories of life. There is culture, there is spiritual, there is custom, there is conservation, there is belonging to the land and territory, and not only geographically but also spiritually.
For the longest time, since time immemorial, indigenous peoples and local communities have been managing, sustaining, and taking care of community conservation areas all over the world. When indigenous peoples and local communities live their lives and are given full protection, that is conservation. It happens. It's the very relationship that they have with their environment.
So I would like to acknowledge our close friends, Kanimat Hashdari, the young Kashkai woman featured in the video. She was a champion for Indigenous peoples and territories of life and passed away tragically on January 8th of this year. We continue to hold her in our hearts in all that we do. So to begin this dialogue on conservation and human rights, we are very grateful to have a message all the way from Ecuador, from Ms. Abigail Gualinga and Mr. Daniel Benalcazar. They are youth leaders from the Quichua Sarayaku. They could not join us live due to connectivity challenges in their territory, but in the following video, they share their powerful vision as youth leaders for the future of nature conservation and the role of human rights in achieving this vision.
Para mí la naturaleza es todo. Todo el hábitat con la biodiversidad, cada uno con un significado simbólico que nos hace conectar entre sí. Entonces, para mí es la existencia de la humanidad. Es para mí la naturaleza, la madre tierra.
Mi visión de la conservación de la naturaleza es que sigue intacta tal y como la tenemos ahora, porque nosotros, y tanto igual que ustedes, vamos a decir que la naturaleza sigue así para que nuestras futuras generaciones la disfruten al igual que nosotros estamos disfrutando ahora. Y acerca de los derechos humanos, yo creo que deberían que ser tanto iguales como para las personas, tanto para los animales y tanto para los árboles, porque aquí en Sarayaku para nosotros es un ser vivo.
Debe cambiar la forma de ver como mercado a los recursos naturales por parte de los países desarrollados y también en los países subdesarrollados que los estados ven como única opción a los recursos naturales como negocio. Entonces, como pueblos originarios, en especial Sarayaku, tiene una propuesta de vida que no es para generar ingreso para el pueblo, sino es para conservar, para que nuestros territorios, para que el territorio indígena sea valorado como ser humano y que tenga derecho como un ser humano y de esta manera protegernos de todas las empresas extractivas.
Thank you, Danielle and Abigail, for those powerful messages. So now let's start our panel discussion. Our first panel will talk about some of the systems and structures underpinning the debates on conservation and human rights. And we have a distinguished set of panelists I'd like to introduce them briefly. We have Dr. Daly Sambo Doro, the international chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. We also have Marco Lambertini, the chief executive officer of WWF International. Then we have Hindu Omaru Ibrahim, the coordinator of the Association for Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad, and co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. And last but not the least, we have Akim Steiner, our administrator of the UNDP. Our first question is for all our panelists, and we will be asking the same question, and we will have Daly responding first, and then Marco, then we will have Hindu to respond, and finally we will have Akim. The question is like this. We are facing interconnected crises of inequality and climate and ecological breakdown. These have only been exacerbated by the pandemic. Grassroots social movements are sweeping the globe, demanding systemic and structural change for the betterment of all. So my question for all four of you is, what does this moment of reckoning mean for our relationships with nature and how we approach nature conservation? And the challenge is answering them, this question, in 2 minutes. So we'll start with Daly.
Qiyanak, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think that this dialogue is so important because uplifting human rights is a legal imperative, a moral imperative, but really it's also an imperative for survival. For Inuit, inequality has meant not having a seat at the table in substantive decision-making, resulting in deleterious impacts in the Arctic. Climate change is but one example of fossil fuel exploitation and use in the South, with devastating and yet untold impacts in our homelands, the Arctic. For centuries, Inuit have had a significant and profound relationship with our environment. We have always recognized that Inuit Nunat, our homelands, our territory, the unique Arctic environment, and everything within our ecosystems are interrelated, interdependent, and intimately interconnected. If one element is disturbed, the whole is disturbed. So for Inuit, as a species within the Arctic environment, again, if one element is disturbed, our way of life is also disrupted and disturbed. In 1977, Eben Hobson, the founder of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, in welcoming delegates to the first organizing meeting of the ICC, he stated, "Our language contains the memory of 4,000 years of human survival through the conservation and good managing of our Arctic wealth. Ours is the language of the very environment. Our language contains the intricate knowledge of the ice that we have seen no others demonstrate." So the behavior of whole societies must recognize that our status as a species within nature, and more important, they must alter their approach to nature conservation. As Haudenosaunee faith keeper Oren Lyons stated at a recent session of the World Economic Forum, the world community requires value change for survival. We must genuinely value nature. We must also recognize respect and value for those Indigenous peoples that have maintained their relationships with nature and who also hold extraordinary wealth of knowledge, intricate knowledge about the environment. So the imperative of recognizing human rights is intimately related to our survival.
Thank you, Daly. So from an indigenous perspective, may we now hear from Marco?
Thank you very much, Teddy. Thank you very much for the invitation. I will start by highlighting what Holly said briefly in her introduction, and that's the evidence has never been clearer than today. We are losing nature and biodiversity at frightening speed. 1 million species driven to extinction, 2/3 of wildlife population declining in less than 50 years. And of course, we're not talking just about pandas and tigers and elephants, but also fish in the ocean, a natural living resource for millions of people. 90% of the fish stocks are either fully fished or overfished. And on the other side, we are failing also on achieving an equitable society with near to 1 billion people still in extreme poverty, and perhaps more, driven by climate change in the next decade or two. So I think in all this bad news, there is, however, some good news. And the main good news is that today we know not only the seriousness of the problem, but we're beginning to understand this is not just about our moral duty to coexist with nature, which of course we all feel very strongly about it, but it's also about our own survival. This is threatening not just wildlife and biodiversity, this is threatening our food security, our water security, our climate, our health, as we learned tragically from COVID. So we're beginning to understand, first of all, the biggest mistake that the modern society have done until now, which is believing that we could develop at the expenses of the environment. And beginning to understand actually an economy based on environmental overexploitation and sustainable exploitation, it is a false economy and is going to lead to more problems than actually benefits in the medium term, because science is very clear, we don't have a lot of time to fix some of these issues. And so decoupling economy and sustainable development continues to be the challenge, but also vis-a-vis this new reckoning and awakening, the hope that finally we can turn our society and economy onto a path to true sustainable development. And in this respect, you heard these wonderful comments from the indigenous people in the movie. In this respect, indigenous and traditional cultures have a lot to teach to the so-called modern world in terms of how to translate this cultural revolution of stopping taking nature for granted into systemic change in the economic model that will also recognize the rights of indigenous people, local communities, and every citizens that interface with nature on the planet.
Thank you, Marco, for your thoughts. May we now have Hindu to also respond and share your thoughts on the same question?
Sure, thank you very much, Teddy. So for me, I think this moment means we need to rebuild our relationship with nature. We need to understand how we can live in harmony with our nature. And that is what indigenous peoples are doing for centuries and centuries of years. We know that in this time, we say we still have like 10 years. I can say less than 10 years, because we know how the climate is really impacting the most impacted peoples, like in my region, in the Sahel. And it's adding to the biodiversity loss. And we are seeing how COVID is becoming in the top of all. So we cannot just stay and let the conservation in this model. We need to change the system. How we can change it? It's how we can have the indigenous peoples to be a partners in each decision that is taken at the global level or at the national level. We know that yesterday it was a big deal that we have over 60 countries come, in all big of them, like France and UK and Germany. They wanted to put peoples and nature in the heart of all the green recovery. But for me, it is not just taking in the discourse or putting in the report. We wanted to see the actions. It is time of action in conservation. Conservation cannot look like only we have to put the number of the species, the numbers of the trees. We have to make it in the realities. It is balance that we wanted to see. It is going back to like my peoples, seeing how my communities are moving from one place to another one to give the breath to the ecosystem to get regenerated in a natural way. How those knowledges can be used and build a resilience for the communities to live in harmony with the nature. How we can invest in a green recovery that call it not only like in money side, but call it in the action that recreate not discrimination, not inequality between the peoples. How we can rebuild back better by giving everyone chance to do not left anyone behind. And especially we are seeing what is happening in Africa. The most vulnerable peoples are the most one who are living in the most impacted ecosystem. And I really love the video from my sister's piece in Horso, and also Tagi, who was there. They was showing that the nature, it is not only trees or birds or insects, it is also the peoples who are living there. It is our rivers, our mountain, our forests. And we all know how the nature is very important for all our life. If we protect nature, nature protect us back. That's what we have to take.
Very well said, Hindu. Thank you very much. And finally, can we have Akim to also share his thoughts?
Thank you, Teddy, and it's a pleasure to join this panel, and I was very keen to be part of this discussion because I want to begin by actually even challenging the let's say the framing of the panel by talking about realigning conservation and aligning nature conservation and human rights, because I think we actually have to go further. Alignment sort of suggests that two things essentially stay the same, they just need to somehow come together. And I think for anybody who has worked at the interface of conservation of nature and people's livelihoods, be they indigenous peoples, be they local communities, be they people who perhaps are in the name of eminent domain expropriated the right of the state in the name of the public good to take away land from people. There are many instances where fundamental rights coincide, but sometimes also clash with conservation. And as somebody who has spent many years working in conservation, I have had too many painful instances where a well-intentioned conservation intervention ultimately was in part, if not sometimes totally defeated by an unintended consequence or simply an unimagined consequence on people and communities in the area. So as IPBES has also suggested, I think we have to reimagine conservation. Because the harsh truth is that the better we do as a human species on this planet, if you just take the last 200-300 years, the longer we live, the longer, the better educated we are, the better our needs are taken care of, the worse nature is off. And this is an equation that has brought us literally to a situation today where planetary systems are threatened. So we have to reimagine conservation. And what IPBES said is we have to perhaps go from a land sparing to a land sharing approach, which is really, Teddy, where you began this discussion. The paradigm of conservation to protect nature against people has reached its limits, and yet we have not progressed in our thinking. And I think rights and conservation are indeed two key variables, but we need to also be honest. They don't necessarily resolve every issue. Whose rights and whose rights are codified? Is prior informed consent that indigenous peoples have so often called for compatible with a constitutional democracy in which people make decisions by majority? So my appeal would be, we need maturity, we need honesty, we need reflection, and we need also self-questioning, because I think this is one of the topics that will define whether we can come up with something better, wiser, and more feasible and more compatible with a world of 8, 9, 10 billion people having to share land. Or we will simply deepen the trenches, raise the fences, and end up in more conflict. And that cannot be the future of conservation. Thank you.
Thank you, Akim. So now we will immediately go to the second round of questions, and I will be asking each of the panelists a specific question. And we will start with Daly. My question is, in order to move forward into the future, we need to acknowledge and understand our past. It is no secret that the conservation industry has a long and painful history of human rights violations, including conflicts with indigenous peoples and communities. How can we better understand this legacy and its root causes in order to truly reimagine conservation? Dr. Duro, please.
Thank you again. I think that's exactly right. I just have to recall personally, my first engagement at the international level took place in 1976, and even before I graduated high school, in the context of the impending ban on Aboriginal taking of bowhead whales by the International Whaling Commission. My late friend Charles Ituk Edwardson, a powerful Inupiat, stated that the people who have called themselves conservationists have chosen not to conserve the Eskimos, we're further compelled to tell the world who we are, the total depth of our environment, and our association with the whale is dependent upon the survival of both communities, the whale as a species and Inuit as a species. Ituk was speaking about the significant clash of the world views and the world perspectives. Later in 1984, myself and a Nanook from Canada, Rhoda Inuksuk, attended the International Union of Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources in San Jose, Costa Rica. We were the only Indigenous persons in the room, and our organization was seeking membership in IUCN in order to influence the world conservation strategy. I have to say it was one of the very few times that I feared for my own personal security. And today, I think such clashes persist. For Inuit, there has rarely ever been a neat alignment of our objectives and those of the conservation industry, as you say in your question. Rather, we have seen subjugation, domination, and exploitation of Indigenous peoples for decades. So in order to truly reimagine conservation, the recognition of and respect for the status, the rights, the role of Indigenous peoples must take place. And more specifically, the rights affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other international human rights instruments must be fully implemented by states as well as by others, including those within the conservation industry. I believe that Mr. Steiner is right, that we need something more than this alignment, but at a minimum, the world community must be responsive to the aspirations of Indigenous peoples, including Inuit. Qiyanak.
Thank you, Daly, for that vivid recounting of your experience in your advocacy, as well as sharing the Indigenous point of view in your reflections to that question. And so now I move on to Marco. I have a brutally frank question for you. In an essay for the New Living Planet Room, Dr. Kanyinke Sena said that the recognition of Indigenous peoples' land rights should be at the center of biodiversity protection. So, Mr. Lambertini, WWF is one of the many conservation organizations advocating for at least 30% of the planet to be protected by 2030. Now, my question is it even possible to achieve this target without recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities?
Thank you so much for that question. Straight and very clear, very happy to answer. So first of all, let me just say the 30% by the end of the decade target is one of the targets that we advocate for. It's not the only one. We also need to curb over exploitation of wildlife. And by the way, this is both on land and the ocean. And this is something that communities can really greatly contribute to, and Indigenous community in particular, by in fighting poaching, in fighting over-exploitation, in fighting wildlife trade, illegal wildlife trade, and so on and so forth. And of course, then we advocate also for a systemic change of the economic drivers that today are actually affecting a lot of the local and Indigenous communities' land. Talking about industrial and artisanal destructive activities, mining, agriculture, conversion for agriculture, and infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So a number of asks that I think all both require the strong engagement of local communities and actually leadership role of particularly Indigenous people. And frankly, there is no way, and we've been clear in our first statement on the 30%, there is no way that we can achieve this percentage of the world on land and in the ocean protected, maintained, sustainably used without recognizing the leadership role that Indigenous people and local community have to play, considering that between 1/3 and half of the world land, for example, is under informal customary land tenure, which is not yet recognized. So that recognition, we believe very strongly, is one of the tools to achieve that 30% targets. But let me conclude by going back to the topic and actually the title of today. I really think that actually conservation has been reimagining itself several times in an inconsistent way, but also perhaps because it has to be tailored to local context as well. is for sure conservation, particularly in the past decades, have been, as Akin put it, has been not good in recognizing some of the unintended consequences. Even my organization has been leading projects that have not been really well designed, well planned, and even well implemented in reconciling the human development and indigenous rights and nature conservation dimensions. So there's no doubt about that. There's been mistakes, and there's still mistakes perhaps done today. But it's also true that in some cases, we have some fantastic example of even places where access of people is regulated, but with a great support to the communities. For example, the gorilla parks in Rwanda, where they are generating immense local economy that benefits communities and their livelihoods. And then there are other situations. When I came back before COVID, just from a visit to our projects with Maasai communities, Maasai conservancies in Kenya, and forest communities in Cameroon, where this is actually actual conservation of places and wildlife and biodiversity through empowering land tenure. And let me just say, we are already, however, struggling. We are struggling in many places to even achieve that vision. With governance, corruption, marginalization, exploitation, and this is pointing in the direction of collaboration. I think conservationists, true conservationists, local communities, indigenous people are on the same agenda. And we really need to find a way to combine forces, because the pressure on nature, on the resources that we all need, and particularly people that live outside nature need, are under increasing pressure, as you know. And so coalition, partnership, convergence is everything in winning this challenge.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you for acknowledging that there's a need for collaboration, especially in acknowledging that 1/3 of the planet is under traditional governance of indigenous peoples. So 1/3 is actually more than 30%. And thank you again for your thoughts. And so now we would like to ask Miss Ibrahim. You were an activist at the age of 16 and have advocated for your community and indigenous peoples more broadly in many international fora. In your experience, how do indigenous peoples' rights, climate justice, and the rights of future generations relate to each other? How does recognition of these rights contribute to a healthy planet? Hindu?
Yeah, even because the rights of indigenous peoples are violated, that's why indigenous people are asking for the climate justice. We are seeing our land territories are violated, our forests are burning, mining is happening. Even in this time of COVID, there is no excuse for any company that are doing the illegal mining. We are seeing our oceans are rising, is heating, and the land of my sister Dali in the Arctic that's hitting, the glaciers are melting. We are seeing my homeland in the Sahel where the resources are shrinking, and then peoples are just fighting to get access to those shrinking resources. So all indigenous people's land are becoming under threat because of other people's action. And those actions lead us to the climate change and now to the loss of biodiversity and, of course, in our all health system and not healthier environment. So that's as the climate injustice that we are living in our land. And we know that we can reverse it. We can reverse it only if we think about respecting the indigenous people rights, recognize the indigenous people wisdom of living in harmony with the nature. It is easy to do if the indigenous peoples come in the center and take the decision with those who are deciding in our behalf. So we are the same, we have the same fight with the peoples who are at the street, fighting for the racial justice, for the like Black Lives Matter and all. What we want our dirigent, our government listen to us. That's all what we are asking for. And they are not listening. That's why we are in this pathway. So we need to come back and listen from the peoples, and especially listen from the wisdom of the peoples that know how to live with the nature, how to restore it. Indigenous peoples have to offer a lot. We have our indigenous people traditional knowledge, that the centuries of knowledge. Let me tell you, just before I come to this panel, I was in another panel of scientists, and then one of the experts like saying, They need one social science peoples who come to indigenous people's land, and in order to record the knowledge and confirm the knowledge. I get so shocked that I jump and cut him, telling him that who are these persons to come and confirm the knowledge of indigenous peoples of thousands of years? Not because we didn't went to school, or we didn't write a PhD, or we do not speak French, English, Arabic in our communities, that we are not expert. So someone who has just a PhD cannot say he's expert than an indigenous peoples. We are expert in our land, and our rights are the most important. If they are respected, we are ready to restore all biodiversity laws, to fight the climate change with our traditional knowledge and with our wisdom. We own the more than 80% of the world biodiversity. So because we know how to protect it, we need just the confidence, and we need to be in the middle of the decision making to reverse or and build a better future for all the humanity.
As usual, very powerful remarks from Hindu. And so now I would like to ask Akim as our fourth panelist. My question is, UNDP's COVID response helps decision makers look beyond crisis recovery towards 2030. It includes a strong focus on human rights, uprooting inequalities, and decoupling economic growth from unsustainable production and consumption. To serve, how do you convince state governments to address these interconnected issues, especially when we are facing growing threats to multilateralism and democracy around the world?
Teddy, that's a tough question to answer in a minute and a half, but I think in part by showing them the risks of inaction. I think if you go back, for example, to the 2019 Human Development Report that UNDP published last year, which was focused on inequality, I think through trying to not only criticize inequality or to postulate it, but to also demonstrate, first of all, the immense price that people pay for it, but also societies, economies, but also where perhaps some of the more effective and efficient ways and fair ways are to address this issue. We very quickly move to the arena that Hindu also called for, action. And I think therein lies perhaps the challenge of our time. We are in a race against time. I mean, if you take the statistics that Marco, WWF, and many others have just put out in the last few weeks, the Global Biodiversity Outlook, we are in a terrible race against time in terms of the impacts on our environment, species extinction. And yet I'm reminded also, in this year when we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, that just across from my office here is the General Assembly Hall, where something very fundamental and very symbolic is true, that every country, large or small, has a seat at the table, has the right to be heard, and is consulted. You do not negate imbalances of power, but I think when we come to indigenous peoples, to communities in conservation, one of the first things we must end is that so many speak on their behalf in other arenas. And I think that's what we have heard also this morning, Dali's example, Hindu's example. And I think when it comes to the future of conservation, which clearly is urgently necessary because we are facing a kind of economic anarchy, an economic tsunami that is washing over the ecology of our planet at the moment, and therefore, protected areas is one response. But I think we must get to a point where, as many of you have pointed out this morning, some of the greatest stewards of biodiversity on some of the most significant remaining biodiversity happen to be indigenous peoples, and they are very often local communities. So let's also bring them to the table. Let's not view them only as right holders that have rights bestowed through some other people's decisions. Let's create the fora nationally, locally, and globally where this can actually be fulfilled. Because I think just to invoke the human rights narrative is not enough. We need to go deeper in order to understand that legislation itself does not create equity and empowerment. And that's where I think conservation, and Marco, you spoke to it very eloquently, needs to be proactive. The same is true for many of the projects that UNDP also works with. we struggle between trying to achieve a result in conservation terms and trying to understand how we can do that in a world full of contradictions, increasingly competing interests, and the need for a fair and equitable way of reconciling them. And I think the more other people impose themselves as the reconciliators, the less likely the solutions are going to be fair, just, and effective at the local level. That is part of rethinking conservation. And in COVID-19, I think we have an opportunity because the world is disturbed with what it has seen. It has revealed so many of the contradictions in a very brutal and a very direct way, and that creates a greater willingness, a greater openness, and a greater possibility to think forward in a different way. And that is why in UNDP we do view this moment, as dark as it is right now, as also a moment in time where we need to think about tomorrow with vision and with courage and imagination, because that is the only way we'll come out of this crisis, not by going back to what was the normal before, which so many of us know was unsustainable, increasingly unfair, and ultimately not likely to help us cope with the 21st century. Back to you, Teddy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Akim Steiner, a UNDP administrator. Very well said. And unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. How I really wish that we had more minutes to have an exchange of ideas. But I am emboldened by the fact that I think this will be a first of hopefully a series of dialogues that will involve all of us, Indigenous peoples, UN agencies, conservation movements and organizations, and even governments. So I'd like to thank Daly, Marco, Hindu, and Akim. I think we all agree that there's a need to do things differently, that there's a new normal, that there's also need for collaboration. And I also am very thankful that everybody acknowledges that the importance of listening to Indigenous peoples, and that there has to be a systemic change in how we do conservation. So again, thank you very much. And we now go to the next panel. And I ask Holly to take over the moderation of our session.
Thank you, Teddy. So as we transition from the first part of this dialogue on systems and structures to the second part, which is focused on practical recommendations and actions, we're grateful to have video remarks from the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Environment and from BirdLife International that will help us anchor the next part of the discussion around the human right to a healthy environment and the latest news with that process.
Hello from Canada. I'm Dr. David Boyd, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. Ladies and gentlemen, this beautiful blue-green Earth is the only planet in the universe that is known to support life. We depend on it for everything, from the air we breathe, to the water we drink, the food we eat, even the stratospheric ozone layer that protects all life on Earth. Nature's contributions to people are immense and irreplaceable. And yet, we have provoked a global nature crisis through human actions, as documented in the reports of the Intergovernmental Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the Living Planet Report, and the latest Global Biodiversity Outlook. As the COVID-19 pandemic makes so painfully clear, humans are not separate from or superior to nature. We are part of nature. Nature is not a commodity for humans to exploit, but a community to which we are so fortunate to belong. I believe that there is one approach that will solve the challenges we face in terms of conservation and human rights, and that is to take a rights-based approach to all actions related to conserving, protecting, restoring, and using biodiversity. A rights-based approach clarifies the obligations of states and businesses, serves as a catalyst for more ambitious action, and empowers all people, but particularly people who are poor and vulnerable, to participate in solutions. And foremost among those groups, of course, are Indigenous peoples and local communities, whose worldviews, whose traditional ecological knowledge, and whose customary laws are scientifically proven to produce superior conservation outcomes, higher levels of biodiversity, greater levels of carbon storage, lower levels of deforestation, and also producing social benefits such as reduced poverty and increased food security. So one of the most important things that we can do is recognize the rights and the tenure of Indigenous peoples and local communities. In my forthcoming report to the UN General Assembly called Human Rights Depend on a Healthy Biosphere, I have a number of recommendations, and just to give you a few of them that would help us in preserving biodiversity and protecting human rights. Number one, every state in the world and the United Nations must recognize that everyone has the right to live in a healthy environment. Number two, we should take a rights base to all aspects of conservation. We must prioritize recognizing in law the titles and tenures of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Wealthy states must commit to mobilizing at least $100 billion annually in order to help low-income states protect, conserve, and restore nature. And we must recognize the urgent imperative of protecting environmental human rights defenders who are under attack in far too many countries. It is not too late to address the global nature crisis, but time is running out. We cannot respect and protect human rights without protecting and restoring nature. And we cannot protect and restore nature without respecting and fulfilling human rights. Thank you all for the work that you do to protect the people we love and the beautiful planet where we live.
BirdLife is the world's largest nature conservation partnership, a family of 115 autonomous organizations, partners across the world. Together, we are the power of many. We take a local to global approach. We recognize that for conservation to work, we need to join forces. BirdLife is proud to be working across the world with Indigenous peoples and local communities on the ground, engaging local conservation groups and a wide variety of local and national stakeholders. Our vision is to scale up this experience around the world so we can save nature together. As a founder member of the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights, we strongly believe that conservation can only work when human rights are taken into account and respected. And conserving nature is good for people. Healthy people need a healthy planet. This means that every one of us, wherever we are, should be encouraged and empowered to take care of nature and have the right to benefit from it. No one is better placed to speak about this than our partners, and I'm honored to pass over to my friend and colleague Bichi de la Paz from BirdLife in the Philippines, the Haribon Foundation, to tell us how they're putting the principles of the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights into practice.
We at Haribon recognize the interdependence of nature and people, and that Indigenous people and local communities, or the IPLCs, are an inseparable part and strong ally in conserving Earth's biodiversity for current and future generations. While the Philippines legally recognizes Indigenous people's rights at the national and international level, implementation falls short. We're working to better safeguard the rights of Indigenous peoples, including women forest defenders, to manage and protect their ancestral land and associated livelihoods and spiritual well-being. Along with Malaysia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, we're also part of BirdLife's Asia-Pacific Forest Governance Project, which is building capacity for civil society to engage in forest governance, including advocating for stronger provisions for IPLCs in the Philippines' new national forest law. We work towards upholding the voices of our IPLC partners and sharing knowledge and skills with each other, so that together we are recognized as the rightful stewards of the earth.
There are amazing examples of local people standing up for the right to a healthy environment all over the world, and 80% of states now recognize these in their constitutions and regional legal frameworks. But the current global health, climate, and ecological emergencies demonstrate that this now needs to be recognized everywhere for all people. To address this, we and nearly 1,000 organizations are calling on all heads of state and governments to recognize the universal right to a healthy environment, to put in place legislation and actions to achieve this, to ensure that this coming decade is the one in which we transform our relationship with nature for the sake of all people and the planet. Join us. We've sent a letter to the UN Human Rights Council, which is meeting right now, calling for it to pass a resolution recognizing this right, and we invite your organizations to sign the letter too. You, as an individual, can also lend your name to a wider One Planet, One Right campaign endorsed by the UN Special Rapporteur David Boyd and BirdLife partners from across the world. Working together, we can make a healthy environment a human right.
Thank you to David, Patricia, and Maria Belinda for preparing these remarks. Our second panel will now focus on practical ways to reimagine conservation and human rights. And I'm very pleased to welcome our panelists, Paul Saintois, President of the Salween Peace Park, one of the 2020 Equator Prize winners. Congratulations again, Paul. Eileen Lee, the Program Director of Environmental Conservation with the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Ambassador Cristian Rafael Guillermet Fernandez, Vice Minister of Multilateral Affairs of Costa Rica, which is also the co-chair of the High Ambition Coalition in the post-2020 biodiversity process. And last but not least, Julius Avinaitwe, Director of Partnership, Communities, and Capacity Building at BirdLife International. Thank you everyone for joining our second panel. And our first question is for all four panelists, starting with Paul and then Eileen. So much needs to be done to truly reimagine conservation. What do you think is the top priority or opportunity right now? And what is your organization or institution doing to address that? So we'll start with Paul, and then Eileen is on deck. Thanks.
Thank you, Holly. The opportunity right now is local and national and international recognition of local and indigenous communities' contribution and solution to sustainable development and nature conservation. What to recognize? Number one, we need to recognize the local indigenous custodian communities as the best frontline defenders of nature. And we have to learn from them, listen to them, and also support them. This territory of life hosts most of the world's remaining biodiversity, so we must not fail to protect them. Number two, the past, we need to recognize the past mistakes of conservation, which did not respect human rights. Protected areas governance must be reorganized in a way that respects human and indigenous people's rights. It is a win-win solution. Otherwise, we will lose more than gain anything from the current status quo. And number three, we need to recognize the sovereign rights of the indigenous people and the RCCAs, or territories of life. And what our organization is doing that, I would like to share the example of the Salween Peace Park as a case here. We are applying a right-based approach and bringing to visibility what conservation by our indigenous people means. We apply our self-determination rights as a first step to collectively govern this park, and then move to local recognition and then the international recognition, which means that this year we receive the Equator Prize. So this is the step that we do. And number two, we are trying to advocate for policy change and legal reform. So we need to we need to work with international community or NGOs, that they also have to be on our side to stand with us and work with us directly based on our locally defined terms. And lastly, we are trying to advocate for inclusive and just conservation. Thank you.
Should I jump in, Holly?
Yes, go for it.
Okay.
Well, I think you framed this challenge as one of reimagining conservation. And I think reimagine is actually the right word for what most needs to happen. Because for conservationists, this is really about recognizing that we can't realize our aspirations for the planet without thinking more expansively, inclusively about what we promulgate as conservation solutions, who we think of as conservationists, and how we go about opening spaces for finding that shared purpose to accelerate the pace and amplify the scale of the change we need in this world to advance both conservation and human rights. And I say this as a funder who enters this space from a mission centered squarely on nature conservation. I want to emphasize this to my fellow conservation funders because I want to be clear that we've evolved our approach to embrace more work in alignment with Indigenous people and local communities, not because we decided to compromise our nature conservation goals, but precisely because we are relentless in the pursuit of our conservation objectives. Indeed, it's our commitment to achieving meaningful and durable impact and to following the evidence about what works that has led us to continually expand our conception of what constitutes fundable conservation work. So what does this look like? For us, it's been about investing in the people, processes, and inputs that allow partners to come to these issues on their own terms, whether those be about culture, food security, sovereignty. We've also provided funding to support partners in their assertion of title or their rights to consultation and litigation support to defend their territories from incursions. We've supported communications resources to enable people to tell their own stories and networking opportunities to allow them to connect with and learn from their Indigenous peers. We are still learning and evolving in these directions, but I know that our conservation work is better for it. And in this moment, when we can all see so clearly how the global crises of climate, nature, and human rights are fundamentally intertwined, I hope we can all muster the imagination to rise to this occasion.
Thank you so much, Paul and Eileen. So the same question to our next two panelists. So for Vice Minister and also for Julius, what do you think is the top priority or opportunity right now for reimagining conservation? And what are your organizations or agencies doing to address that? Mr. Vice Minister? Sir, you're on mute.
Perfect. Hello. How are you? Thank Holly, Paul, Eileen, and Julius. Thank you very much for having me here. I think that from the perspective of government as Costa Rica, as a country, the first contribution that we can give to the world and this common task that we have, and to change this paradigm, is to be very, very ambitious. Do you hear me? Did you hear me? Hello? Did you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for this little technical problem. I was saying that as a government and from the point of view of Costa Rica, the most important, the first thing that we need to have is to be very, very ambitious. This must be our trademark. We need to be ambitious and to continue to work on that. As you may know, Costa Rica is co-leading with France a high ambition coalition and for nature and people. And the idea of this interregional group over more than 30 countries established to achieve an ambitious deal for the Convention on Biological Diversity is to reverse the severe trend of biodiversity loss and revive ecosystems that are critical to species and humanity survival. More specifically, this coalition, as you mentioned before, is championing for the protection of at least 30% of the marine and 30% of land ecosystems by 2030. This is an innovative approach to conservation, drawing lessons from the past and knowing what happening since the Aichi targets. But it's sure we cannot fulfill our responsibility to safeguard the world's remaining biodiversity without working hand in hand with indigenous peoples and local communities, and respecting the rights and traditions knowledge. They are often the world's best stewards of nature. This is something that everybody agrees in this panel. We believe that this increased target should promote indigenous-led conservation. We need to ensure that indigenous rights are respected and their communities are engaged as partners in the design and management of protected areas and ensuring free, priority, and informed consent. And this is something that we need to mention here and to emphasize. It's not only the indigenous communities, but also with a gender approach that we need to have, because this is the way of the success. Indigenous peoples with a gender approach. Furthermore, yes, you may know Costa Rica and the other ambitious partners that we have leading consultations in Geneva, something that was referring my good friend, Mr. Boyd, regarding the possibility to table a resolution in the Human Rights Council to have the recognition of the right to a healthy environment. We need, this is a fundamental step in this task that we have. We need to put forward to make a recognition of this right. And finally, the third point that I want to raise is that you may know that Costa Rica plays a very important role in the negotiation of a regional treaty regarding which is the name is Escazú Agreement, which is to reach the most vulnerable, exclude groups through affirmative measures and allows for the full exercise of the access to their access rights. This is something which looks like the Aarhus Convention in Europe, but for us, this is in our region something that is very important, and this is part of our engagement in this task. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. So I'll turn it over now to Julius from BirdLife for your response to the same question.
Okay. Thanks very much, Holly. Dear panelists, we have an unmissable opportunity right now to rebalance the way we live and to repair our relationship with the planet. We know that this is possible, and tomorrow, BirdLife will be launching a report on the state of the world birds, which shows examples of how species have been brought from the brink of extinction, and some pockets of ecosystems have been restored successfully. BirdLife has stepped forward to galvanize this work, and as mentioned by the minister, and also by David at the beginning, under the umbrella of seeking the right to a healthy natural environment as one of the universal human rights. So this effort serves as a vehicle for mobilizing humanity to take action, including and especially at the local level. These actions must, in addition to addressing biodiversity, look at the climate emergency as well as the social inequalities in society. Therefore, we should be striving for an equitable, carbon neutral, and nature positive world through this human right to a natural environment. So what BirdLife is doing, together with other organizations, for example, through the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights, we are mobilizing and empowering a broad constituency of civil society to develop the leadership, advocacy, engagement, and collaboration skills which are necessary to empower and support indigenous peoples and local communities' inclusion in the debate. Because we recognize that better support to the role and the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities as stewards of biodiversity is completely essential to achieve this successful outcome. We know that this is just the beginning of the road. We don't only want to pass this human right at the General Assembly, but we hope that it will be included in the whole of UN and into the wider multilateral environmental agreements, and also in terms of implementation at the national level, for example, in the Paris Agreement, but more crucially, in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is currently under negotiation.
Thank you, Julius. So we will turn now to the individual questions for each of our panelists. And Paul, please be on standby coming up next. So Akim had mentioned, and I think also Vice Minister Christian had also mentioned, this right to free, prior, and informed consent. And this is certainly a really crucial one in Indigenous people's rights in international law. And we have a particular situation that might lend itself to more discussion here. So when an organization proposes a conservation initiative that might affect Indigenous peoples or communities, I think we all know that they have an obligation to seek their free, prior, and informed consent. There is often a lot of confusion around FPIC, and in some situations it has even become a box-ticking exercise. So Paul, our question for you, what does FPIC mean in practice to you and your community? And when FPIC and other human rights are properly respected, what are the implications for nature conservation?
Yes, from our Indigenous people's worldview, we understand that FPIC means respect of both physical and spiritual territorial sovereignty of our Indigenous peoples. Why? Because even our Indigenous people must do FPIC. For example, people, before we do anything to our land, we need to perform ritual ceremonies to ask for permission, forgiveness, and offer gratitude to the spirits of the lands. So this is why FPIC is so important for us, and then also for the conservations and governments also to understand this and also respect it. And if we talk about the process, FPIC means from like a community majority that we need FPIC, not just the leaders. FPIC is an ongoing, continuous process, not just a one-off. And FPIC also needs to be done not only to protect against harmful development projects, it also needs to be done for researchers as well. For example, when they do wildlife survey, fish research, something like that, they need to get FPIC first before they do that. And I mean, I have reason why I say this. I can also elaborate if it's a question. And also FPIC is definitely not a simple consultation. It is a consent to no or yes. When FPIC and other human rights are properly respected, there is even no need for an outside organization to come and propose a conservation initiative, because we already know that Indigenous people and local communities, they already have been doing conservations, and we need to see that. And by working with them and applying FPIC, we already, the processes, we already lead to conservation by local and Indigenous communities with strong ownership and robust governance, because of by applying the FPIC and other human rights tools, we encourage and we also empower local communities to be able to do their local governance, especially nature conservation. So this is what we understand the free, prior, and informed consent in practice. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think there's a lot of wisdom within that, and of course, many generations of lived experience there that we need to draw from and learn from in the context of other outside initiatives in Indigenous territories. So one of the concerns with the conservation industry is that the vast majority of conservation funding and associated political support actually goes to large and already well-established organizations. And despite growing evidence that, as we've been hearing, Indigenous peoples and communities are the stewards of a significant portion of the planet, they receive comparatively very little funding and political backing. So Eileen, if I may ask a very direct question, what would it take for conservation funders to direct more support to such communities? And how do you think this relates to broader debates within philanthropy right now about things like redistributing wealth?
Thank you, Holly. Well, I guess the first thing I would say is I do think the evidence about impact matters. It's certainly the main factor that has reshaped our funding in this area. And I think we're starting to see signs that donor awareness on this is shifting. For example, as a number of the speakers have referenced today, the dialogue about raising global ambitions for nature in the run-up to next year's CBD COP, I think has 2 points have really started to change that narrative. First, the data that shows that about 40% of protected and ecologically intact landscapes are under Indigenous peoples' custodianship. And second, the really growing body of evidence that lands under Indigenous management on average actually deliver better results for biodiversity than other areas, including those under formal systems of protection. I think that is actually changing the conversation about how we set conservation targets and about how conservation financing should flow. I guess the second thing I'd say is that even with this generic understanding of why stewardship of Indigenous peoples matter, funders can often have an incomplete understanding of how these findings relate to the specific opportunities and challenges in the landscapes and seascapes they care about, particularly if their traditional NGO partners and advisors take a narrow view of what conservation success requires. Diversifying the voices that shape our perspective as funders, being aware of the role that some of our NGO partners can play as gatekeepers and opening them up and opening ourselves up to bringing in different perspectives, and also seeking out new advisors that diversify and supplement the voices that are at the table with us is I think, critical. Third, I think maybe what I would just share is that for a conservation funder like us, it's also important to just know that it's okay to enter into relationship with Indigenous communities based on a transparent and authentic conversation about the extents and limits of the partnerships that we're able to pursue. I always think of this as inviting partners to kind of co-create the Venn diagram, right, that identifies the shared purpose we can build from, but also acknowledges the potential limitations of our collaborations. And otherwise, I think conservation funders can be uncomfortable navigating these entry points, and that discomfort can translate into avoidance. Finally, we've also found that having funding partners who are already engaged with the Indigenous community in question from a different entry point, whether focused on culture, rights, or economic development, can be a real asset in many ways. They help new funders educate themselves about how to engage effectively with Indigenous communities, and they can also provide complementary streams of funding that support community needs that might feel out of scope for a conservation funder. And I think these kind of cross-silo funding collaboratives can be critical to helping crowd in more conservation funding. As to how this all relates to decolonizing philanthropy, I won't pretend to be an expert, but I think it comes down to a couple of things. First, I do think it's important to acknowledge and recognize history and reflect that in the decisions we make about grant making. So for example, we support a coalition effort where all of the NGOs, save the tribal entity, receive their grants through an intermediary. Because that legacy of colonialism and the shadow that it casts is real, we've made a decision to treat the tribal entity differently in terms of how the funders support them. The second thing I'd say is it probably just comes down to a conscious awareness of whose voices are dominating our understanding of the needs and how Indigenous voices can be systematically excluded unless we create the space to learn and to listen, and hopefully get better at it over time.
Thank you so much, Eileen, for sharing that very, very honestly. We appreciate that. My next question, as we are running a little bit behind, so we're going to keep it moving quickly along. Mr. Vice Minister from Costa Rica. So critics say that the current draft of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework actually falls far short of what we truly need for the future of the planet. And Costa Rica is, of course, co-chair of the High Ambition Coalition in the post-2020 process, and also one of the 64 countries to endorse this brand new Leaders Pledge for Nature, which was just launched yesterday and includes recognition of human rights very clearly. So from the perspective of an experienced diplomat, such as yourself, what needs to happen between now and the 15th Conference of the Parties to translate these lofty pledges into reality in the negotiation process?
Thank you, Holly. Again, I will repeat, we need to be very ambitious and very optimistic and really continue to fight for this perspective and this future that we want. And I think the COVID-19 give us, and the subsequent economic crisis call upon us to challenge our relationships with nature and our failed social contract. I think that this crisis gives us an opportunity to change our minds and to start working close to those who are engaged in this protection and the vision that we common have. We need to also, and here this is going to be a very challenging issue, is how we succeed to have financial flows to move towards this decision and this plan 2020, post 2020. And we need to find ways to develop an economy which is sustainable, but with linkage with a green economy and looking for a different relation in our consumption. Costa Rica believes that the nature-based solutions are the best tool we have to give back to the planet its dignity. And probably we need, as I said, a very inclusive approach, working with our sisters and brothers from the indigenous peoples, and also to have a very extensive education and pedagogical approach with the nature, with other parts of the society. We need to make understand the people that the climate change is something that is real, that the loss of biodiversity is something real, and it affects us in our daily life. And this is something that we how can I say it? We need to go for these discussions from people that are really committed, as all that are attending today, or myself, that I'm a diplomat and I'm dealing with that, to those people who are in the street, walking now, going to the work, and take into account that this is the future that we need to challenge the crisis that we are living actually. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And I know there are lots of debates about nature-based solutions as well, and that's another conversation I hope we can have at some point, maybe in a subsequent session of this dialogue series. So to turn to our final panelist, I'll ask Julius to be ready. So the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights was established in 2009 by 7 international NGOs, including BirdLife, as well as WWF, who was in our first panel. Despite some steps forward with the Conservation Initiative, there are many critiques that remain that these organizations have not done enough to implement human rights commitments. So Julius, we'd love to hear from you. What are the step changes that need to happen within these conservation organizations to really build trust, ensure accountability that everyone is seeking, and try to come together around shared values?
Thanks very much, Holly. Yes, in some ways, as you mentioned, this is not a very straightforward affair in terms of conservation and rights. The first point relates to the context. So, for instance, globally, not all countries recognize the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities in conservation. So, as you are working on the ground, you find that the context differs, and where there is already recognition of, for instance, the rights of local communities and so on, working in the countries like Costa Rica, you find it much easier than in others. So that may be reflecting the kind of different views of how the conservation initiative on human rights has been successful or not successful as such. The second point is that actually the world has moved on, in a sense that in many places, the biodiversity, of course, is remaining in places where local communities, indigenous peoples are the custodians, but the context in which they are practicing their activities, their traditional ways of working, and so on, is changing, driven in part by globalization and all these consumption needs that are not necessarily local, but drive through trade and so on, all these pressures. So, as such, there is a need really to engage in terms of how practices need to adapt to take into account those changes, so as they continue to provide the critical role in terms of safeguarding biodiversity. And therefore, the language with which different actors interact with the indigenous peoples, local communities, needs to be addressed in the sense that you actually talk about values in similar ways. The way that we are looking at this happening, for example, is through this request or this push to have the right to a natural environment included under the universal human rights, because this now provides the platform for all stakeholders, be them civil society, business, governments, indigenous peoples, and everyone, to not only have a stake in terms of pushing for nature, but to have also the opportunity for challenging situations which don't lead towards a natural environment. So I see this as some of the steps that could be taken.
Thank you so much, Julius, for sharing that. And to all of our panelists in this second part of the session, you know, it's going very quickly. I really wish we had more time for actual dialogue between everyone. Some of the key points that have come up, I think there has been very clear recognition amongst all the panelists today of the significant contributions of Indigenous peoples and communities to nature conservation. We should not also forget that these contributions are also to healthy and sustainable local economies, to gender equality, to youth, and so on. So we're not only talking about nature conservation for the sake of conservation, but for the sake of healthy communities, healthy people, as necessary for a healthy planet as well, as David Boyd so eloquently stated. So in addition to that, we have seen we've heard experiences from conservation organizations and funders alike sharing that they have shifted their approaches, their strategies, and so on in recognition of these contributions and acknowledging this is not a matter of mission drift, but it's actually very squarely in pursuit of their conservation objectives in partnership and wherever possible, from their perspective, supporting Indigenous peoples and communities to be in leadership positions themselves. I think it's also clear we need the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to be very ambitious. And then the definition of ambition really must explicitly include human rights. It must explicitly include tackling these inequalities that are so pervasive at the moment. So with that, thank you again to all of our panelists from the second half of the session. I'll now turn it over to my co-moderator, Teddy, to bring us into the final part of their session.
Thank you, Holly. Okay, so now for the final part of our session, we would like to welcome back all our panelists for their closing remarks. And I'd like to give you, 30 seconds or less to share with us what's your key takeaway message for the Biodiversity Summit tomorrow. So we will start with Hindu, and then we'll have Marco, Paul, Julius, Eileen, Christian, and finally Daly. So Hindu, can you share with us your final remarks, key takeaway message?
Thank you. I think the world government who will meeting tomorrow, and especially business investor, all of them need to integrate the value of the nature in them decision making that can protect all of us. We have to respect the rights of indigenous peoples, protect the environmental right defenders, and recognize the indigenous people's knowledge are valuable to protect us from all those crises we are facing from the loss of biodiversity. Finally, stop rolling back environmental protection in protected area by mining, drilling, or deforestation. Green recovery cannot be leaving anyone behind. It's have to take the peoples in the middles, and those peoples are indigenous peoples and the local communities that living in harmony with the nature since centuries. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindu. Can we have Paul? And then after him, we'll have, Marco first, and then after him, we'll have Paul. Marco?
Thank you very much, Teddy. Fantastic debate so far. Listen, I think my parting comment will be highlighting the greatest challenge and opportunity that we're facing, which is actually to truly integrate human development and nature conservation, and particularly integrate the rights of people, individual rights, as well as collective rights, and the rights of nature. It's not anymore about picking one at the expenses of the other. It's about integrating those three key dimensions in one approach. The way we live our lives, we design our project, we implement policies on the ground. And I think this is the only way we can really, only ticking these three boxes, is the only way we can truly achieve sustainable and equitable development.
Thank you, Paul. Next, we'll have, Marco, I'm sorry. Next, we will have Paul, and after him, we will have Julius. Paul?
Thank you, Teddy. Yes, the key takeaway is that really the world's leaders need to listen to the indigenous people and understand our worldview in all the conservation and other development processes. I think this is key. And then really having the very ambitious targets, biodiversity targets, it needs to also match it with really how much the conservation really respect the indigenous people's rights and human rights, right? Matching how much lands that are under the protection of indigenous people and be recognized by the government. So this is really my kind of takeaway. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Now we will have Julius.
My takeaway is healthy people need a healthy environment. So we must really take this conservation seriously and do it with people and for people, and in particular, the indigenous peoples and local communities. We must be recognizing and implementing the right to healthy environment, taking into account issues of equity, and also ensuring that those who do not address nature and who cause the challenges to nature actually can have repercussions in terms of, let's say, ways of stopping them from preventing and stopping them from destroying nature.
Thank you, Julius. Now I'll ask Eileen to give us her takeaway message.
Ali, for encouraging this dialogue. I think for me, what I hear is a deep and urgent recognition that the crises facing nature and the assaults on human rights are fundamentally intertwined. And I hear a lot of goodwill that people want to work differently together to really find those integrated solutions. So thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. And now we shall have Christian.
Thank you very much. And I think that we need to be, again, very ambitious, but most important, lead by action. And on this, I think that the first step, and this you can have also the commitment of the government of Costa Rica, is that we will continue to push forward the resolution and the idea to have recognized the right to a healthy environment. And third thing that is the most important also is to continue to work with the indigenous peoples and communities, because they are the guarants also of all the territories and the nature. Thank you very much, and it's a very, very interesting conversation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Minister. And finally, she was the first to speak, and so now we shall have the final word from the panelists from Daily.
Thank you very much. I want to say that it's important for everyone to acknowledge the dynamic of rights ritualism that we have seen. Indigenous peoples across the globe have seen governments subscribe to the human rights framework within the United Nations. Yet at the same time, the recent comments by Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, commentary on how governments are utilizing the pandemic to diminish the rights of Indigenous peoples. I think it's imperative that we recognize the kind of rights ritualism that takes place, and potentially also within the context of a right to a safe and healthy environment. So my comments about the imperative of recognizing and respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples is not merely invoking human rights, but more significantly for governments and many others to uphold their legal obligations and their commitments to Indigenous peoples in order for us to reimagine the conservation of nature and the important role that we as human beings, as a species within the environment, within nature, and recognizing its biodiversity is central. This has to be valued. And again, I believe that Oren Lyons, in his commentary about value change for survival, is at the core of this. There's so much more that I could say, but I think it is important for others to recognize that rights ritualism should be a thing of the past, and that actually honoring, respecting, and recognizing our rights and implementing our rights is a key dimension to the future and the future of nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Daily. And with that, I would like to thank all our panelists for all your sharings. As for me, my simple takeaway is that we may come from different perspectives, we may have different approaches, but I think if you look really deeply into our exchanges, there are really more things that binds us together than keep us apart. And so we have heard from so many people today from all around the world, and we may be approaching conservation and human rights from different perspectives and approaches, but we are arguably working towards the same goals. The shared values that underpin indigenous and community worldviews and international human rights should be the common threads that weave together our collective responses to these extraordinary times. We join the panelists in calling on world leaders to commit to systemic and structural changes in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework to ensure a healthy and equitable planet for all.
Thank you, Teddy. And this was the first in a series of dialogues on conservation and human rights that our organization, the ICCA Consortium, is organizing with UNDP in the run-up to the CBD Conference of the Parties next year. We hope that everyone who has joined today, both live and, well, everyone's remotely, but live and live stream, will join our next sessions as well. Thank you so much to all of the speakers and panelists for coming to this virtual table with open hearts and minds, holding each other accountable and finding points of convergence on such complex issues really does require humility and patience and courage and trust. So finally, a big thanks to all the organizers and interpreters working hard behind the scenes, and to everyone who joined us from around the world. Good night from here and take care.